should make it pretty easy for you to complete this assignment, as long as you read the book. Okay, when you get to the course homepage, right up there, the Lessons tab, that's where just about everything for our class is anyway, so when you click on that, we know the References Materials is the very first folder. When you click on that, there's a series of subfolders, and right down here towards the bottom is one called Book Review References. If we click on that, we'll see several different items on there. First is the list. I guess that's a duplicate entry. I'm still cleaning these up. Online students, I think their stuff for one course is in the folder already. The other course should be getting organized this afternoon. That list, anything on it, you do not have to worry about getting that approved before you start reading it. You can go ahead and pick one of those titles, order the book, just put the title in the Dropbox. You don't have to worry about those because those are all acceptable for the assignment. If you're picking one and say you had a topic and you wanted me to make some suggestions, if I suggested something to you, the same thing, you can submit those already. If you had a book that you wanted to do that was not on the list, then you need to send me the title so that I can tell you whether or not it's going to be acceptable for this assignment. So if it's on our list, if it's one that I recommended, you're fine, go ahead, you can order the book. If it's one that you just want to do and you haven't gotten approval yet, get the approval first, don't order the book, and then pay for it, and then find out it's not adequate for this particular assignment. All right. Underneath that, there is a book review rubric. You can see that better if you go to the rubric that's actually embedded in Angel. And the Dropbox for the book review is in the Week 12 folder. Just like the essays, when you click on that, you look at the page where you submit, there'll be a link down there that says View Rubric. Then we have a file for the guidelines for writing a book review. There's a checklist. Also put in some of the basic Chicago Manual style citation formats. Keep in mind, depending on the book that you have, those citations may or may not cover that particular book. An example in that is the basic citations where you got one author, a title, and a publisher. As we mentioned in discussion before class, I don't think that citation guide has the proper citation format for an ebook. So if you're using an ebook, you'll have to look it up in the Manual for Writers. Some other instances, like if you have a book where it's translated, special format for that. If you have a book where there's an editor instead of an author, that's also a different citation format. If you have a book that is published by an organization, I don't think you would see that for the book review, but you might have sources for a research paper that are like that. That's a different type of citation format. So if you find your particular type of citation in that file, you can go ahead and rely on that. If you can't, then you have to go and read, see what the example is in the Manual for Writers. The research paper is going to have a bunch of different types of sources. You could also use articles for the research paper, for example. You will have to do primary sources for the research paper, and those you'll have to look up in the Manual for Writers. Their citations might be online somewhere. They're not in the document that I put up there, though. All right, as we go through again, just to show this link. One thing about this is when it comes up, there are several book titles that are actually on there. These are all good. Down here you have a link to the Bancroft Prize winners. Anyone that covers something that we covered in this class is acceptable. Right? Let's see, this one, Anne Hyde, Empires of Nations, Families, A History of the North American West, 1800 to 1860. Definitely fits in the period of time for this particular class, that one's acceptable. Given the date there, you shouldn't have any trouble figuring out that that's acceptable. So you can observe. Some of them you can't tell from the dates. For example, this one, the Mortal Sea Fishing, the Atlantic, and the Age of Sail. If you're doubtful as to whether we were using sails during the period of the first half of American history, I think maybe we didn't invent sails till like 1900, then inquire before choosing the book, or find out more from it. You can usually find out a description from Amazon.com, Google Books again, and usually you can get that from the introduction or from the table of contents even. Age of Fracture, what time period does that cover? We don't know, right? So that's one you would have to do, look up. Right? Dorothea Lange, A Life Beyond Limits of Abigail. Beyond Limits, is that before or after the class? We don't know. Abigail Adams, hopefully you know that would fit into the time frame of this book, this course. Here's one, The Cigarette Century, Rise, Fall, and Deadly Persistence of the Product That Defined America. That would be the first or the second half of this course.
Second half.
It'd be the second half, yeah. We used tobacco, obviously Jamestown was built on it, but they actually didn't start rolling up in cigarettes till like after the Civil War, really. Some of them may have some let's say some more world history type topics. I don't think you'll run into that here. If they do, then it would probably still be usable because it would be like American diplomatic history. The other thing is you can also use any one that's on the Pulitzer Prize list, as long as it was written after, it's about 1975, it has to be fairly recent. Several of these, by the way, are on one of the two lists also. They are Bancroft or Pulitzer Prize winners. Okay, when you go back, you can open up the PDF that shows the guidelines for reading, for writing the book review. Pull that up as much as possible. Right. As I mentioned, sometimes it's also called a critical review essay. What distinguishes a book review from a book report? The purpose of a review is not just to report on the contents. There is a summary. It should be very short. The majority of your book review should be focused on an evaluation of it. He says, the purpose is to evaluate and provide a critical commentary on its contents. In other words, you're critiquing the book, critiquing everything about the book. That includes the writing style. You want to go through the bibliography and put in some type of evaluation of the sources that they use. Do they have enough of them? What type do they use? Is it mostly secondary? Is it mostly primary? You also want to critique the author to some extent. The main question there is, are they qualified to write the book, in your view? Some of the books that are on your list, they were chosen because there are some things in the author's lives that may call into question their competency on the subjects. I think we were talking about Joseph Ellis. He's actually one of them. He has a little controversy in his life. And it may or may not affect the quality of his historical writing. Okay, generally as follows. This is going to be your format. Again, there is some license with this. You can play with the format a little bit. As long as you get everything in there, you'll have the content correct. Format is provided to you because organization is a part of the grade. As long as it's well organized, you're fine. Following the format should help you to keep it organized. But there are other ways of organizing it and keeping it with a good flow and keeping it with a logical sense of order. Right? First thing you should do is not include a title page. Book reviews don't have title pages. The research papers do. The book review starts just with a simple heading that gives the complete bibliographical information at the top of the page. Should be an entry just like you'd put in your bibliography. The only exception is after the period, after the bibliography, you can say reviewed by and put your name there. Now, why do we use the different formats? Why is it a big deal whether you use a title page or not? Well, it's because basically you're learning to write history, like you would if you're a historian. If you go into one of those journals, you're probably going to look at some of the academic journals when you're doing your research paper. If you go through and you just scan it beyond the article that you're using, one of the sections you're going to find is book reviews. And there's a specific format that they follow, usually something along the lines of this. For them, what they're concerned about is money. And they do have an academic purpose, but they need to make a profit or at least not go into debt publishing this stuff. Well, what's one of the biggest costs when you're publishing an old school paper journal?
And the facts may change?
No, not really. I mean, the facts may change, but that's not really an issue as far as what's published at a given time. The biggest cost to the publisher is materials that go into the actual journal itself physically. Paper. Well, if you got 7 book reviews, each one has a title page, that's 7 pages that basically eat up money for no purpose. You'll see some of these book reviews, different styles of book reviews, but you'll see them in all the journals, and you'll see them in newspapers. You get the local paper, you're looking usually the section on your local community or state maybe, but there'll be a section where they may have at least one book review. Some of local section, they'll review local authors' works. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the big papers. You ever seen that thing like New York Times bestseller list? Well, they put the bestseller list and they also have a lot of reviews of those books in it. They don't waste space. And what we're trying to do for the book review is also not waste space. So you just start with the bibliographic heading, keep a little bit of a gap between that and start the text, and you go right into the text. Okay. As you might expect, you start off with an introduction. You basically tell what book you're going to review, and then you go into the author's credentials. The things you want to look at in his credentials or her credentials, their education, and what level of education and where they were educated, place of employment, if it's relevant, especially. And a lot of these people are professors writing these books, so they're a professor of history at University of Georgia, for example. Well, that would go to their qualifications for writing the book. Maybe if you're doing like a military history, somebody who is high-ranking officer in the Army, Navy, whatever. That may go to their validity if they're writing military history. You might actually say it's an impediment if they're writing like a history of a medieval church, though. So keep those things in mind because you are actually wanting to evaluate their competency, at least on paper. Any previous achievements that they've had, good examples, any awards they may have won, prizes they may have won, the Bancroft Prize, if you pick off that list, obviously they won that. Pulitzer Prize list, same thing. Some of them have won each, might not be for the same work. Most of them have written several books. One may have won the Pulitzer, one the Bancroft. There are some who've won more than one Pulitzer. So note that. When you're talking about those authors, avoid using the titles. You just use their name, refer to them as Doctor, General, Reverend, President, whatever. And that should be fairly limited. 1 to 2 paragraphs should suffice for that. And as I mentioned, there are some who have some other things if you dig just a little deeper. There's some who misrepresented their work histories. Some have misrepresented military careers. Some have been accused of plagiarism. Some of our top historians have been accused of plagiarism before. So all those things should factor into this. The things you don't really need in there, where was the person born, is that necessarily relevant? But it could be relevant. So that's one of the things you have to put a little bit of critical analysis into before you decide whether to leave it out or include it. It may make a difference if you're writing about Reconstruction, if the author was born in segregation era South Carolina. That may make a difference, and then that combined with their race may make a difference. If it's a white person, segregation when he's growing up, that may impact his bias. And of course, if it's African American, he's going to have a different bias, but his bias is going to be shaped perhaps by the fact that he was born in the South during segregation and was raised in that atmosphere. Notice here, third part is a brief summary. Not a long summary, but a brief one. This is where you start your main body of the review. Briefly describe the content and organization of the book, along with the most important evidence used. You don't have to get bogged down in details. You need enough to show that you've read the book, give the idea of what it's about to the person who's reading your review. And then you go into the main part, which is the critical assessment. This is the part that's important. And go through this, I'll stress, because obviously everyone's presumably hearing what I'm saying. You read the reference guide, it also tells you that the main difference is the critical element. However, the number one thing that I get on papers that get lower grades is something that is a very long summary, and then they end with 2 paragraphs of evaluation. The bulk of it needs to be the evaluation, and the summary should be the part that's short. All right, the first thing you need to do is look for that thing. It's a word that we have seen before, right? It was stressed when we went over the essay writing. It's stressed in all the guides. What you want to do is isolate the author's thesis. Because the critical part, the analysis part, is mostly going to be dedicated to the question of whether the author adequately proves their thesis. Or if you want to be literal, you can say it's always an opinion, so you can never 100% prove it. Adequately supports their thesis. And when you evaluate every individual element, ask the question, is there enough stuff in the bibliography? Enough sources? Enough primary sources? Whichever question you want to put in there to support the thesis that the person advocates. This is also one thing that's going to be different from the way you normally read a book. The first thing you want to know is the thesis. Now, where is the thesis going to be found?
In the first paragraph?
Probably in the introduction. Might not be the very first paragraph. It's probably going to be, a book is more or less essays within essays. Their thesis is more than likely going to be the end of the introduction. If it's not in the introduction, where else might they put it?
The conclusion.
In the conclusion. And sometimes you might see a preface, then an introduction. So maybe in the preface, maybe in the introduction. You don't find it in either, you go to the conclusion. Feel free to read the book out of order. First thing you want to find is the thesis. So go through the introduction. If it's not there, go through the last paragraph, or last chapter. Might not be labeled chapter, but it might be labeled conclusion. Might be labeled epilogue. I find it there sometimes. However they wrap the thing up. And once you isolate that, you, of course, can go ahead and start on your writing of the book review at that point. technically, you could write the introduction to start with, because you don't need to know anything about what's in the book yet. You're introducing the book, you're talking about the qualifications. You can go home, get on the internet, and write that part today. But everything else is dependent upon the thesis, so you need to know that, because as you're going through the text of the main part, you're evaluating how they support the thesis. You don't want to read the whole thing and then have to go back and do that in retrospect. You want to do that as you're reading, so find it first, and then go back. Sometimes that thesis is not going to be easy to find. Keep in mind, as we said, when we went over how you should construct a thesis, that thesis is going to be your opinion. However, to have a strong thesis, you do not state it and say, well, in my opinion, such and such. And you don't acknowledge in the thesis that there's necessarily another side. You say your opinion as if it was fact. So your thesis may be hidden in with some facts, and you've got to recognize that that's something that's not necessarily provable, that it is an opinion. I do have a lot of students who have trouble finding that thesis. They're bringing their book to me, can you help me find it? And it's not always easy. Another thing, not to get confused, but the thesis is not necessarily their purpose in writing the book. Their thesis is a conclusion that's drawn from their examination of facts that they have available to them. The thesis is an opinion. The thesis is, something that they have to do after they've accumulated all this information. Their purpose in the book may be different, so don't get those two confused. I'll give you a good example. One of my professors wrote a book. His purpose was to look at a body of sources that scholars hadn't really analyzed in depth before. He was looking at information, what kind of information can you get out of newspaper advertisements for runaway slaves. His purpose was to see what that body of information contained. His thesis would have been some opinion he drew based on that. See, he came up with the purpose before he started reading all those slave advertisements. You can't develop a thesis until you've already read that stuff. So his purpose drove him to write the book. His thesis was essentially his conclusion after he looked at the facts. Okay. Notice, see, this is in bold, so this kind of reiterates what I said. The main body of a critical review is concerned with thesis development. And it's defined here. That is, did the author achieve their stated purpose? Did they defend that thesis? You will inspect each of the chapters to see how the thesis is or is not developed. If the author makes progress, develops a thesis convincingly, you need to provide adequate information and tell us what you think he had in there that showed that he did support his thesis. Right. Along with this, you can, as you can see, subdivide that. So as you ask how well he supports his thesis, one thing you want to identify, the author's perspective, his point of view, or purpose. And you can approach that in a number of ways. For example, is he writing a military history, an economic history, a social history, a religious history? All of that. Right? That's the approach. The perspective, again, may be tied to something we'll look at later. Bias. Is it informed by a religious or political ideology? This goes to that question of bias too. If you have somebody who's writing a history of the labor movement, and they're a modern Republican, and you have another person who's a modern-day liberal Democrat, are they going to have the same opinion about the effects of labor on the U.S.? Unionization, basically.
Not really.
What does a Republican candidate say about unions?
Non-union.
Yeah. They're bad, right? And of course, you're on the liberal side of the spectrum, what do they say about unions?
They're good.
They're good. Okay. One is that the capitalists are ripping off the workers, and the other is the unions are ripping off the capitalists. Right, so that political ideology makes a big difference. Religious ideology, when we're looking at the United States, it is predominantly Christian. That would probably come up more frequently, you would think, in world history, where you got crusades with Muslims fighting Christians. Right? It is still relevant, particularly for this first half of the class. For example, if you have a Catholic writing about the Puritans, how did the Puritans and Catholics get along? Not at all. If you were a Catholic in Massachusetts, did you have freedom of religion?
No.
No. Did you even have life? you could be executed for maybe not practicing your religion, but you could be executed for trying to teach that religion to other people. Kind of like what you see in the Middle Eastern countries today. Christians in all those countries, they are usually more or less left alone, legally speaking. But if they try to convert someone from Islam to Christianity, it's a death penalty offense. So when you're looking at this period, it makes a difference whether, in this case, not so much that what we think of as religion in the sense of being Christian, but in denomination. What do the Quakers think of the Puritans? What do they think of the Catholics, Anglicans, later on, Baptists, Methodists, all those groups that sprout up just before the Revolution? What do the people, all those denominations think of the Mormons when they come up? All those are in the first half of this class. And modern practitioners of those individual denominations still are going to have their views flavored by their particular religious upbringing. All right. If the book describes a conflict, does the author favor one side or the other? So again, a little bit of bias, bless you. Does the author state the purpose of the book in the introduction or conclusion? And we talked about the difference between purpose and thesis. Their purpose could be like my professor wanted to examine a new body of sources. Another one might want to bring to light some aspect of slavery that's never been discussed before as a topic, rather than looking at a particular source. Some might want to specifically say they're going to add to the body because this has never been looked at from the perspective of particular political ideology, particular religious ideology. They may actually state the purpose, and that may show that they have some bias. Third, this is the most commonly part that is left out. Look at the author's evidence. What sources did he or she use? Most frequently left out is going to be an evaluation of the bibliography and sources. So again, don't read this in order. You can actually go through and do some of this as soon as the day you get your book. Skip to the bibliography, look and see. Some things you can tell is mostly primary sources, secondary sources, combination of both, maybe how old the sources are. If the newest book among the secondary sources is one that's written in 1953, there's probably a lot of scholarship they're ignoring. At the same time, if they are writing the book themselves, you got one that's from 1976, you wouldn't expect a lot of the new material to be in there. So keep that in mind and evaluate the sources, the freshness of the sources based on the perspective of when the author is writing the book. Go through, you may see at the end of each chapter a set of endnotes, or you may see a bunch of footnotes and they put all the actual citations at the end of the whole book. But go through wherever they have their citations and see, for example, if they're writing a chapter that's 50 pages and you see 3 sources, what does that tell you about that particular chapter? See, that chapter is well sourced.
For that chapter?
For that chapter, yeah, 50 pages, 3 sources.
It depends on what their purpose is.
It may depend on the purpose of the chapter. Yeah, sometimes they're there's like a key author who's written a history of some period, and there's an actual part chapter that may be designed just to critique someone's previous writing. It might be appropriate only to have like the things that person wrote, which might be like 3. Generally speaking, if you're doing like a full analysis of the topic, 3 sources is pretty thin. You might expect something like 50 sources for 50 pages, 25 sources for 50 pages. But look at the chapter's endnotes, footnotes, whatever, and see how many there are. See what kind of sources they use for a particular chapter. You may notice, for example, that in chapter 1 it's all secondary sources. Chapter 2 is all primary sources. That could be part of your evaluation. That too might be completely appropriate. The first chapter might be a review of what's been written before. And then the second chapter, it's all about whatever they're adding to the field of study. You might expect that. What you wouldn't expect then is for chapter 2 to also be all secondary sources. All right. Example they have here, a history of European witch trials based only on Inquisition records would be one-sided, would it not?
Yeah.
Definitely. If you looked at the Catholic Church, all the priests that were convicting people of witchcraft, what would, and that's the only source you use, what would you come to as a conclusion?
One, that it's biased, so,
You would know that that author was biased.
yes.
What conclusion would the author have come to more likely? Or a few American history perspective, Salem witch trials, the only thing you looked at was the writings of the judges and the accusers. You didn't look at anything from the people who were actually accused or their relatives. You only looked at the trial records. What? It was one-sided. What would the author have likely concluded if that was the only evidence they were looking at?
But they were benefiting everyone.
There were a lot of witches running around. It was a good thing they were killing these people. If you expand that and look at the diaries of the, either the people who were executed or their families, you might see that there's a lot more going on. If you read the textbook, they mentioned it was, coincidentally, it was all like these women who were executed, who owned property, and that once executed seemed to be all the rich people who were accusing them of witchcraft, who bought up their property real cheap. Well, you find that out looking at legal records, not the Inquisition records. Well, that's a legal record too, but you look at the property deeds and all these other types of legal records. That gives you a whole new perspective. Like, well, maybe these people are, one, these women are a little different because a lot of them are remaining independent, so maybe they got some questions about their role in society. Maybe they're executed for that. And then, of course, someone's making a profit off this.
Maybe they didn't want to sell, maybe they were offered to sell.
So you get a very different conclusion. Right? So even if they don't state an obvious bias, when you look at the sources, you may still find them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. The author may also be writing something like what my professor did, where he said, well, we just got these records of runaway slaves, nobody's really looked at them, so I'm going to break into them and see, well, maybe you got something where, well, nobody's ever looked at the Inquisition records, I'm just going to focus on that to see what is in these sources. So it might not be bad that they only rely on one body of sources, depending, again, on their purpose. But that's the point of the exercise, because you have to apply some level of critical analysis on everything. Right. Here's some questions that you want to seek to answer. Is there an adequate development of the thesis? And then you explain why or why not. What's their purpose? Again, that is different. And of course, do they achieve their purpose? Why or why not? Do they approach the subject with any biases? Several things you can look at. Their theological, experiential, philosophical, political, cultural, all that. That's part of their background. Does that influence their philosophy? You had someone writing about the concentration camps, and they were one of the people in them, Jewish person in them. One perspective. It'd be kind of hard to write that without Einstein, I would imagine. All right, do they support his or her thesis? This is not the same question as whether they developed the thesis. This goes to other factors. Do they consider and refute opposing viewpoints? And some other questions in that, is it limited to specific academic levels? Everything here should be college level, but some things you might come up with here. You know, this is basically a good introduction to a topic that anyone could read. Some other books may assume that you have some knowledge of the topic already, so you just maybe say something like, if you haven't at least had like a college level introduction to U.S. history, this isn't going to make sense to you. And if you've got like something where this looks like it was written for third graders, then you probably have a problem with the book you chose. And then this part, is it relevant to contemporary culture? Just about everything in history should be relevant to contemporary culture. So the real question you want to ask is not whether it is or not, but how it is. Is a history of slavery relevant to our culture today? We got rid of slavery a long time ago, right? But does it still have an impact on society? Yeah. Can you trace modern racism all the way back to slavery? Of course. Same thing with women's rights. Are we still debating things based on roles that were defined in the 1600s, colonial period? Yes. Are we still having religious debates along those same lines? Yes.
Those are things that I don't think will ever change.
More than likely, not.
Because there isn't going to be just one, and I say one religion. Everyone's going to have their own point of view on it.
By nature, yes, I think you're right. Does the author resort to a suppression of evidence that supports opposing opinions in order to make his thesis credible? That's called slanting the evidence. If so, what additional evidence would weaken the case? Unless you've read other books on the topic, you may not have a thorough grasp of what evidence they may be suppressing. Two things here: they could be ignoring the evidence, just not looking at sources you may know are out there. If you read the section in your textbook that covers the topic that you have, you should be getting at least something of a feel of whether there is a conflicting viewpoint out there. Not always. Sometimes they're going to take what's the established viewpoint, and a good example is for the people in the second half of the class when they're doing World War I or the Great Depression. One of the guys who wrote some Pulitzer Prize winning histories on that era include a guy named David Kennedy. Where have we seen that name before? David Kennedy. Anyone know where that name comes from? You have seen it before. He's the author of your textbook. Or one of them. So you would probably expect that whatever he wrote in his books that he published is not going to conflict much with the textbook. If he suppressed sources, you might not find that out from reading the American Passage. Okay. Is the thesis sound but is it weakened or marred by flawed procedure? In other words, is there a thesis that sounds logical, sounds like you could defend it, but he just doesn't he just does not present adequate information, or he writes it poorly, and so the thesis looks logical, believable, and everything to you, but you're just not convinced by his argument. And of course, corollary to that is, if he doesn't prove, maybe he should have thought of a different thesis. Is the author's case proved? or would another thesis, that is the corollary to that previous question, essentially. Right, end with a conclusion. You want to assess some of the structural things in the book. How well is it organized? Does he have a good writing style? Does his style recommend it to a specific readership? Some of you might be doing like the medical history. It might be something that is written so that anyone can benefit from it. The writing style is clear. They start with the assumption you already don't know anything about the history of medicine or about the practice of medicine. On the other hand, it might be a book that's written assuming that you know something about virology, immunization, etc. It might not just have some, a base that you're working from certain historical assumptions that you already know stuff, but that you know certain scientific stuff already. In that case, you might come to the conclusion, this is not a book for just anybody. This is probably going to benefit someone in the medical field more than it would just a regular person. Right? Offer a final evaluation of the book, how valuable it is. Notice it says how valuable it is. It does not say, is it good or bad? Because how much analysis are you displaying when you say, well, the book was good?
No.
None. How valuable is it? How much impact can it have on your knowledge? How important is it to read the book? This is a great book to read. It's on slavery. It explains a lot about how it started, and it actually goes in depth and ties it to modern society, explains a lot of racial issues we have in Ferguson, Missouri right now. The final summary should include the major strengths and weaknesses of the book, and that's a part of that question. You want to answer that. And if you answer that, you in effect do answer these two questions. Evaluate its value for readers who may be interested in that particular field of inquiry. This is great work if you want to study medical history, great work if you want to study the Civil War, great work if you want to know more about this guy, whoever you're looking at, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, whomever. Your primary purpose is to respond both positively and negatively. That's why saying it's good or it's bad is very inadequate. All the books are going to have some positives, all the books are going to have some negatives. I had one who had history on something on the Roman Empire, maybe it was the Roman Republic in the summer, written by a British author. Said, oh, it was a topic I was interested in, but the guy's writing is so boring. The guy was British. They do have a certain style they tend to use over there, where they present a whole bunch of facts in a very dry manner. So negatively, it was a hard book to read because it was very dry. However, positively, if you want to know about the Roman whatever, you have more information than anything else you're going to read. All right. And basically, this just reiterates what we just said there. Some questions in there again. What are the strengths? What contributions does the book make? Why should a person read the book? And that's a key one. That you are probably going to answer the question how valuable it is. If you answer, why should a person read the book? What did you learn from this book? Right, did it have more information on the slave trade than anything I've ever seen? Or it provided a totally different perspective. Everybody's, if you think of concentration camps, who do you think of being in it? Who do the Germans kill off in the concentration camps?
Jews.
You always think of Jews. So you might get a book that's written by gypsies. You know, they killed about 60% of the Jews in Europe. They killed about 90% of the gypsies in there. And most people don't even know that. The numbers were less, but the percentage was greater. Oh, that's one thing you might learn from the book. This is something that shows that concentration camps in World War II were not just focused on Jews, they hated everybody. How might you apply the lessons of the book to contemporary society? And why might it be important to current world, or in our case, national conditions? A history of labor might go right into that, for example. Still have a lot of those issues. Would you recommend it to other students? And then who particularly would you recommend it to? Just regular students, to a good book for regular people, you know, doing the writing style. Well, this book reads like a novel, it's very informative, but it's easy to read. Anybody's going to pick up a lot from it. Or, as we said, well, this is something that would be great for someone in the medical field. You need to have a science background. If they've got that background, they're going to learn a lot about development of history. If you don't have that background, it's probably not going to make sense to you.
May not be an interest to you.
And that too, definitely. All right, these guidelines go into some of the basics of stylistic errors. Again, remember, don't put subheadings in the book review. I should be able to read your paragraph and tell that you're talking about the author's bias. You should not have to put a thing that says author's biases. If I'm reading a paragraph, if you wrote it well, I'll know that. And if it's well organized, same thing. Flow correct. And one thing you can do is put those headings in, write it, and then delete them since we got word processors. And that will help you stay organized as you're writing. But don't leave them in when you turn it in. Use first and second person sparingly. It does say that you can use I when you're referring to your opinion of the text. If you write it well, you still can do that for third person as well. Don't say don't, can't, won't, doesn't in the book review, or the research paper, or the essays. Or the one thing about style that I'm looking at is that it is in an academic style. So the only exception to the rule that you do not use contractions is if they are in a quotation. Use the active voice as much as possible. If you go over that in Doc English 1101, don't use passive voice, don't use forms of the verb to be like is, was. Use an active voice. Don't really look at that too much, but it does make the writing flow better generally. Okay. Be clear and concise. Don't repeat yourself. Don't go over the same topic twice. Remember, you're conserving space. If you're doing it well, you shouldn't have any trouble filling up the 5 pages that you see down there is the 4th page limit. If you get 5 pages where you're saying the same thing over and over again, it's not well anyway. Basically, you get through the same grade as if you only wrote it once. Right. Use your spell check. However, do not completely trust it. You still will not catch all the errors just with spell check. So, review it, edit it yourself, read it. It is also a good idea to have someone that you trust also review. You do have a tendency to miss things that you wrote, especially when it comes to like sentence structure, because you read it as you imagined it and it flows. Someone else may apply a different flow and then it becomes confused. So get someone you trust, have them look at it as well. That can be one of the people in the class, someone else you know. I guess it could be me. I don't really want to do it though. I got to read all these things at the end of the semester anyway. Yeah, actually, I think I actually have a Dropbox for a rough draft of it in there somewhere. It is not graded, so that is for your benefit. And usually I have some people who avail themselves of it. Some people don't. But if you submit it, I'll look at it and get some feedback to you. And then just to reiterate, proofread your paper, finish it, proof it again, set it aside. And if you write it, finish up in time, you can lay it over for a week, come back to it, take a look at it again. It may look different to you. And then, of course, page limit 5 to 7 pages. Most of them would be about 5 pages. The endnotes do not count towards this limit itself. You really shouldn't have a whole lot of sources in a bibliography. That doesn't count towards it either. If the only source you use is the book itself, you don't really need a bibliography. Why not? You've already provided a bibliographical entry at the very top as your heading. Now, you do have to evaluate the author's sources. If this is one of the authors where there's some controversy, are you going to find that on the inside cover of the book that you're reading? They're going to make that guy who wrote the book sound like he walks on water. So if there's any controversy, you're going to find it elsewhere. If there isn't any controversy you find anywhere else, then you're free to just put what's in the book cover. If you do, then you're going to have a second source and you will need a references page. Now, where do you find information on the author?
You're gonna find it in, you can find it in Galileo.
You can, yeah, go to Galileo, you'll find some stuff. Some of these people have done some stuff that's actually gotten written up in newspapers and journals. Time magazine, trade journals, academic journals. Some of these people are going to be still working at universities. They'll have a bio page, usually, on that department's website, or other organizations for which they may work. You may find some have actually put their resumes out there. That's not too infrequent. You might find them on LinkedIn, and they may have their work history up there. Would be incomplete, and that, of course, would be from their perspective. So they're not going to say that they plagiarized stuff. Right? But look first, if there's nothing different from what you find on the book cover, then you're fine just using that. You don't even need a references page. You will need a citation page, footnotes, endnotes, because one of the things when you get the rubric that you're going to see is you got to have about 5 quotations in there, all properly cited. And that would mean going back to your Arabian Manual for Writers, and finding the proper citation format for that. Okay, any questions so far? Good on all this? Okay, good. All right. Now, we got, what, 15 minutes, so let's briefly just get into the research paper somewhat. Right. We've looked at an essay, we've written one. Basically, that's the structure that you're going to have for the research paper. Main difference is the research paper is going to be much longer and more involved. Also, you are presented with a question when you did the essay. When you do the research paper, you have to pick a topic you're interested in, come up with a question you want to answer yourself. So no question is provided for you. As we start off here, the first question is, how do we pick a topic? And online students, this has already been assigned to them. Go to chapters really 1 and 2, primarily chapter 2, in the Manual for Writers. It will give you some advice on how to pick a topic that will be adequate for a research paper. Keep in mind your page limit. I think I'm going to put down, I haven't actually finalized this yet, but 7 to 10 pages sounds about right. That does not include the title page, references page. That's both your footnotes or your bibliography. Okay? It's kind of a trick to that. If you use footnotes, they use up extra space. If you put them as an endnote, it doesn't count. On the other hand, it's hard to get the footnotes right. Computers, using Microsoft Word, it's actually a lot easier than it used to be. Used to actually prefer to just add on the extra page and do endnotes back when we were on typewriters. But on computers, you might want to do it. Footnotes. It does give you a little bit of a trick there. I should tell you about that. Yes, ma'am?
Is it still okay to use the parenthesis method?
Actually, no. For most historical works, they prefer the full endnote or footnote. And that's why we're going to go with both for the book review and for the research paper. For the essay, it didn't really matter because if you quoted, use citations. We haven't gone over citations yet, so as long as you did a proper attribution, did not matter to me. But usually in the field of history, it's appropriate to use foot or endnotes. Was it like MLA and APA? I think both use parentheticals. That's their preferred style. They also have a foot and endnote style, but they prefer the parenthesis. History, they prefer the footnote. There is a reason for that too, and it's because oftentimes in history you actually have a little bit more explanation. Once you put the source down there, it might be followed by a sentence explaining its relevance, sometimes explaining that there's more than one sources. Sometimes you get facts, and especially if they're in dispute, you will provide a citation and it will actually maybe list 4 or 5 sources in that one foot or endnote. So that looks bad in a parenthesis. You have a parenthesis, and then you have, at the end of a sentence, you have a parenthesis with 5 sentences in it. That looks bad. So you put it in a footnote where it doesn't clutter up the actual text as much. Hopefully y'all's will be a little simpler than that. You probably wouldn't see that until you got up to like maybe senior level here type historical writing. Here's we'll do the format properly from the beginning. Choosing a topic, number 1, again, pick something that's interesting to you. And that may be on the same topic as what your book review is going to be on. Like I said, that would then provide one of the sources for you. However, it is also perfectly fine if you got 2 topics that interest you to do your book review on one and do the research paper on the other. Now, the topic needs to be somewhat narrow. If you want to do a history, let's say you're looking at a biography or something about Andrew Jackson's life, if your topic is Andrew Jackson, that's not going to work because you cannot provide adequate information in there. It has to be something narrower than that about Andrew Jackson. So maybe his relationship with his adopted child, which would be interesting. Native Americans view him as one of the worst, and started that whole Trail of Tears and everything. It's also interesting he adopted I think it was a Creek Indian orphan, and raised him in his own house. So looking at that particular subtopic might shed a whole lot of light on his internal psyche. It's definitely an interesting examination. How could he kick all the Indians out, at the same time take one in and keep him as a family member? How did he process that in his mind? That's an interesting topic. And it's more narrowly defined. And you should still be able to find a lot of interest in it. I mean, sources on it. Now, if you get your topic too narrow, you run the risk of not having enough sources. And that may be one where you don't have enough sources on it. But what you do there is you start with that, you can start with the narrow topic. And it's actually better to do so, because as you find out you're not going to have enough sources, when you're doing your research, you're probably going to find sources that are somewhat related to that topic, and you can expand on it. In that case, you might start off with his relationship with his adopted son, find out there's not enough information, so you expand out to his relationship to all his children. You might have enough sources for that. That's easier to do than start with Andrew Jackson and just, you literally start with, there's like a guy who wrote a 3-volume biography on him. It takes up 8 inches of space horizontally on a bookshelf. You would have to go through all that and read those biographies incomplete before you maybe found something of interest. It's narrow enough for the assignment. So it is a little better to start off narrow and broad than it is to start off broad and try to narrow. Right. Something like the Civil War, start off with, that's obviously going to be too broad. Maybe you want to look at the Civil War in Georgia. That's also going to be too broad. So then maybe you get down to a county level, a specific battle. Something like Gettysburg, books have been written on that. The Battle of Atlanta, books have been written on that. You might get down to where you're looking at just one key day in a particular battle. It can be any type of topic. You can do something biographical, Andrew Jackson. You can do something on a particular event, the Trail of Tears, the Battle of New Orleans. And some of you can see they would cross those 2 examples. kind of cross with the biography of Andrew Jackson. You might do something Indian relations with the federal government, Indian relations with the state government. A legal history, some aspect of how the Constitution was drafted, some aspect of how the laws in general were changing in the United States. How are marriage laws changing in the 1830s? Do something religious. What were the relationship between Mormons and their neighbors? Literally anything's open as long as it's U.S. history and it's, you know, most intensive purposes up to and including the Civil War and Reconstruction. You could do something like if you see one of the books on the list was Founding Brothers. The guy wrote about relationships between individuals. Somewhat biographical, a little bit expanded, but in particular, relationship between Madison and Hamilton, Hamilton and Burr. You could focus just on, for example, Aaron Burr's duel with Alexander Hamilton. You could focus on another key event. You could Alexander Hamilton's treason trial, when he tried to steal half the United States, make himself president of it. You can get into, if you like, into the conspiracy theory stuff. There's some conspiracy theories. That was one of them, actually. There's also the first third party in America was something called the Anti-Masonic Party. People started to think that the Masons were behind the scenes manipulating all the politics. Kind of our first conspiracy theory. How many of y'all you have noticed that there's like a whole bunch of conspiracy theories around Kennedy's assassination in '63? Yeah, well, how many of y'all know that there was likewise a bunch of conspiracy theories around Abraham Lincoln's assassination? Some people thought John Wilkes Booth ended his life tending bar somewhere in Texas, and that somebody else was killed and they passed him off as John Wilkes Booth. All that is in there somewhere. Don't go too far out of conspiracy theory stuff. You want stuff that you can actually find some actual legitimate historical evidence on. You can go back to the colonial period. This chapter does cover, this first chapter we just finished just does cover Spanish, Brazilian, everybody else starting colonies in what's now Mexico, the Caribbean, South America. That we don't want to open up. Probably don't want to open up yourself because you do have to use primary resources for this. That's going to be, meaning that you'd be like translating a bunch of Spanish, Portuguese, Swedish, whatever documents. You probably don't want to do that. Especially, you consider, you notice there's a difference between the people writing English now and where they wrote it back in 1600. Same thing applies to the other languages, so you wouldn't just be translating Spanish to English, but 1500s Spanish to English. You probably don't want that problem. How many of y'all have an idea already of what you want to write the research paper on? Good. You're kind of ahead of the game. How many of y'all think you got a topic that's narrow enough for you to, the rest of you need to work on narrowing it down a little bit? Right, that's good. Not a major problem. We'll get that done by next week. I think Monday we're off for Labor Day, right? Okay, so it'll be Wednesday. With that, I'm going to try to arrange for the following week to have the librarian in here to tell you about the resources that are available to us on physical and electronic versions.
You said this is due next week?
The topic is due. Now, when you put the topic in, it's all right at this point if it's overly broad. But I want to know what you want to kind of write on. And if it's overly broad, then we can work on narrowing it down. Right? But you got to have some idea of what you want to do. My research paper is something on U.S. history. It is way too broad even at this point. If it's the Civil War, that's okay. Because we can narrow that down. We know you want to do the Civil War. If it's, I want to do something on colonial history, that might be a little too broad at this point. Individual facet of religion and colonial history. Still very broad, books have been written on that. So try to get it down at least narrow enough so it's something we can work with and have some idea of where we can go and get it in a focused direction. Right. Your Chapter 2 in the Turabian Manual for Writers, go ahead and read in that. It's got some advice in there. And take a look at that. We'll come back on Wednesday next week. We'll go into some course material. We should be up to about Chapter 4 now. Since it is a Wednesday, you should actually come to class having read Chapter 4. It looks like we may have dropped enough people who can actually have an in-class quiz. So, not that I'm saying I'll give one, but you may want to be prepared for one. If
How
you
long
don't,
would this quiz be?
that's just be a few questions. That's like 10 maximum. 5 might be a little small.
Would it be open book?
No. It'd be kind of illogical, since what you're probably more or less testing with a quiz would be whether or not people are reading. So open book would necessarily facilitate an adequate evaluation of that.
So assessment type questions?
Assessment type. I would probably pull them from the same pool as your assessments.
Okay.
So, which would also mean not just reading, but completing assessment would be a good idea. Interest in class time, I may just leave it online. You can do it at home. If that's the case, if you got like a 10-question quiz, I'll probably only give you like 10 minutes to finish it, so that you can't really use the book very well. And if you are using the book, you would actually have to know where to go to find a specific answer. So I would be comfortable with that. And again, to know exactly where an answer was, you pretty much have to have read the chapter 2. So still kind of comfortable with that. We'll go into the research paper a bit more on Wednesday and focus on narrowing those topics down. Any questions? The video, by the way, is for the online students, but I will post it up to your class as well. So